Hello, I'm Tom Gregory with Youngstown Christian Television. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel here and watching the program that you're about to see. Before you do that, if you could hit the subscribe button and join us, that way you'll always be informed of what's going on with Youngstown Christian Television every time we put a new video up on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, a program produced by Youngstown Christian Television. In this program, we attempt to look at the biblical record of history and compare and contrast it with the secular viewpoint of history. And in so doing, gain some insight into the ancient world, but also possibly some insight into our scriptures as well. And the end result, that we can have a greater trust and confidence in the Bible that we hold in our hands today. Today, we're going to be looking at something that I think is very exciting. We're going to begin, at least, a journey to the ancient land of Egypt. Ancient Egypt has much to offer us in relationship to many different biblical characters, as well as the interest of what transpired in that civilization itself. I think you're going to be very interested in what we have to see today and in the weeks to come. So, ancient Egypt. We begin with what we call the Archaic period, and that is the period before the empires really begin. And then we look at what caused people to settle in Egypt. As in any civilization, people initially settle because of water. And in Egypt, the water is the Nile River. The Nile River is extremely important for Egypt. In fact, if you look at a map of Africa, of the world, of Egypt, most likely you'll see a river in Egypt and a little bit of green along the sides. I used to think that was probably maybe a little more vegetation than what was in the rest of the area. But when I was there, I found out that not only was it just a little vegetation, it's the only vegetation. That once you get beyond that green strip along the side of the Nile, out to either side, it is a vast wasteland. There's nothing there, nothing growing there. And so the Nile River is extremely important to Egypt, as we'll see. The ancient Egyptians didn't call it the Nile. That was a name given to it by later Europeans that arrived there. They called it the Black River because during the seasons when it was flooding, it had a lot of soil and therefore looked black. Now, the land of Egypt was protected in part by the Nile. People settled there because of the water, but the Nile itself, rather than being a means by which people, especially to the south, might invade Egypt, became a part of what protected Egypt through the cataracts. There are a number of waterfalls in the south of Egypt that prevents people coming by boat. To the west and to the east of Egypt, there are the deserts, and that helps to prevent people attacking. And so Egypt was kept somewhat safe from its beginning because of these natural surroundings. Now let's talk more about the importance of the Nile River. The Nile River experiences 3 seasons. Most of you to whom I'm talking have 4 seasons. And I'm not talking about the singing group, but we have winter, spring, summer, fall. But when you're living in Egypt and you're dependent on the Nile River, there are actually 3 seasons. The first season was the flooding season, and that took place from June through September. The flooding of the Nile was started from snow melting in the mountains down south of Egypt in Africa. And as those snows melted, just like it happens in our spring, they begin to swell the rivers, and the Nile River coming down from the mountains, coming into Egypt, brought with it a lot of the topsoil and different soils that were up in the mountains. And so as they brought that down, and as the floodwaters came, they not only brought water, which would expand the banks of the Nile and give a large area in which they could plant, but it also brought rich soil with it. So that's the flood season. Well, the flooding season, once the flooding goes down, what would be the next thing that you might do if you are an agricultural society? What would you do after the flooding? Right, you would plant. And so the planting season is from October to February. Now, once you had the flooding season and then the planting season, what comes next? I know you might say growing season, but they don't have to do anything there. They just let it grow. And then the last season would be harvest, and that's from March through May. I thought I'd just show you through some scenes on the Nile, just as you appreciate the beauty of it. Here's a picture I took of a sailboat on the Nile River. And that reminds me, by the way, that in Egyptian hieroglyphics, when they wanted to indicate directions, they used a picture of a boat with a sail as a boat going south, because that's going against the current. The current of the Nile runs from the south to the north. And so a picture of a boat with a sail is going against the current. So a picture of a boat with a sail means south. A picture of a boat without a sail means north. Here's a water buffalo along the Nile. And you can see the lush grass that's growing there. Now, we were there in the summer, and so that would normally be the flooding time. However, because of the Aswan Dam being built, I think in the late 50s, early 60s, they no longer have a flooding season, but they allow enough water out to bring water to the sides of the Nile. Here's another picture. You can see that the vegetation grows out to where those trees are, and beyond that is mountainous wasteland. There's nothing there. It's dirt. See the same thing again. Now, of course, any pictures at night on a body of water with the moon shining or the sun going down are nice. And this was a nice picture my wife took of a sunset on the Nile. And here we are going along the Nile further. We were in a small ship on a cruise down the Nile for 3 or 4 days. And so a lot of the time we're just traveling before we got off to look at temples and things. So a lot of good vegetation along there. Here's a couple of people gathering vegetation in their boat. It's another sailboat. There's a water buffalo enjoying a cool bath. And can you see the animal in the shade under the palm trees there? Some more water buffalo. You can see that they are domesticated. And this is an interesting picture my wife took as we were going along. There was a trash fire along the way, and she said that some people came with a hose to put out the fire, but there was a hole in the hose, and they couldn't get the water to the fire. So the only thing I could think of to plug up the hole was to put a rock on it. Of course, that didn't work at all. I don't know how it turned out because, we kept sailing by. All right, so that's the Nile River. It's the number one focus of Egypt, living in Egypt, is the Nile. Now, I want us to move historically from that archaic period to the next period in Egyptian history, and that's called the united Egypt. It's at that time that a man by the name of Menes brought about the first dynasty. That is, he brought Egypt together. He was the first one to use the term Pharaoh, which means great house. He also employed a vizier, which is an overseer of all the works of the king. And we're going to come upon that term later. You're going to see that's an important idea. Menes, when he conquered, he came actually from the south of Egypt and conquered the north of Egypt. And when he became the king or Pharaoh over all of Egypt, he changed his name to Narmer. He reigned for 62 years. Now here is an item that is still in existence called the Palette of Narmer. On the left you see a realistic photo of it. On the right you see a colored in version that helps you to see what's on the palette. If you look at the picture of the king, he's holding a club and he's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and he is smiting a captive of war. A hawk, you see there, which represents the king himself, as Horus, holds an enemy by a nose ring. You see that? And sits upon 6 flowers, which stands for 6,000, which is probably the number of prisoners that were taken. Behind the Pharaoh, do you see who's back there? Can you tell what he's doing, what he's carrying? He's carrying the Pharaoh's sandals. At the top you see 2 heads of the cow goddess Hathor, and flanking the king's name. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but his name is in between there, which is made up of a catfish and a chisel. On the bottom, you see 2 fallen men with the sign town and its name, which is pictured by a rosette. On the opposite side, which we'll look at now, we're going to see some other things. It's not colored in, unfortunately, but we can still see that the triumphant king is pictured there again. In the upper left, this time he's wearing, you can't tell, it's a red crown of Lower Egypt. So this palette of Narmer is picturing the uniting of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. This might be a good time for me to explain upper and lower, because it's not like on the map. On the map, we look at what's north as being upper. We look at Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, because it's to the north. But mostly through history, when people are talking about upper and lower, they're talking about topography. And in Egypt, the higher ground, the ground from which the Nile flows, is southern Egypt. Therefore, that is Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt is where the Nile flows into the delta and then to the Mediterranean Sea. That's Lower Egypt. So it's got to be turned around in our minds from what we normally think when we look at a map. Upper Egypt is south and Lower Egypt is north. Okay? We got that straight? Let's continue looking at the palette of Narmer. Before him are his standard bearers, and then you see the 2 rows right above my finger here. If I move my finger the right way, there it is. Right above my finger, there are 2 rows of bodies. I don't know if you can see them there. Can you tell what's missing from the bodies? If you said their heads, you're correct. But their heads are not entirely gone. Look more carefully at the picture. I don't know if you can see that, but their heads are between their legs. See the heads there? All right, great. And let's see. Oh, in the middle we have something very interesting. We have what most historians call 2 mythological animals. And they symbolize the reconciliation of Upper and Lower Egypt as their necks are intertwined. Now, if you ever watch giraffes, you might see them do something like this. As they have long necks, they intertwine their necks. either as a show of affection or sometimes they do that to fight each other. But I would contend that these are not mythological creatures. I think these are creatures that the Egyptians had seen, because these are simply a form of dinosaur that we would call today. These are creatures that are pictured in a lot of ancient buildings, a lot of pictures all over the world. And we dealt with that some in one of our first videos when we talked about dragons and dinosaurs. So these are creatures that were known, and they used them to symbolize the bringing together of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now at the bottom, by the way, at the top you see the Hathor cows again, and at the bottom there is a bull representing the king destroying a captured fortress. So the bull is the king, and that man laying there and the design there around the man are indicating the king destroying that fortress, indicating his victory. Okay, so that is Narmer, or Menes, as his name was, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Let me explain a little bit about the crowns that we already mentioned. As we said, the white crown is the crown of Upper Egypt. That's the crown that Menes wore in coming to Lower Egypt and defeating them. The red crown is that of Lower Egypt. And you can see some other crowns there as well that are sometimes used. But what you'll see from this point on is that pharaohs will wear a combination of the white crown and the red crown. And so you'll see this white crown, the picture that you see on there, as well as the red crown with that part coming up behind, wearing that together. Now one of the things, I forgot to mention, how Menes or Narmer met his end. He was carried off by a hippo. Now, you may not know this, but most deaths in Africa by wild animals are done by hippos, not lions, hippos. You've got to be really careful of them. If you're ever in Africa on a boat and you see a bunch of hippos, good time to get out of there. Anyway, so he was carried off by a hippo and was killed. As we think about Egypt, just as we did with the other civilizations, we look at how they wrote. And in Egypt, the picture writing, as you're probably already aware, was called hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics is using pictures to form words and ideas, not letters. And you can see on the left pictures that are indicating something. They're on a horizontal plane. But if you look at the picture on the right, these hieroglyphics aren't going horizontally, they're going vertically. And in fact, if you look at hieroglyphics, if you're reading hieroglyphics, which of course I cannot do, you have to look for certain signs as to whether to read it right to left, left to right, and top to bottom or bottom to top. And it can keep going whatever way. But beautiful pictures also that are painted in association with the hieroglyphics that we find. If you're interested in finding your name in hieroglyphics, then there's a website you can go to. And if that one doesn't work, you can just Google my name in hieroglyphics and you can probably find a spot to do that. I wanted to show you some of the ancient structures that still have hieroglyphics on them today, after thousands of years. Look at this is the great hypostyle hall at the Temple of Karnak. Now, Temple of Karnak was begun during, it'd be about, I think about 4,000 years ago or 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And another pharaohs kept adding on to it after that. But look at these pillars. Look at the hieroglyphics carved into these pillars. Now keep in mind that at one time there was a roof on this. The roof is no longer there in this Temple of Karnak. By the way, do you see down there in the bottom right hand, the bottom of the column on the right underneath the figure? There are some hieroglyphics, and there is kind of an oval around them. That's called a cartouche, and that means that's the name of a pharaoh. So when you see hieroglyphics with that circle around it, that is the name of a pharaoh, cartouche. Now here's some interesting pictures. Here's in the temple of Edfu. Here is a pharaoh being baptized with Nile water in preparation to enter the temple of Horus. And you thought that Christians invented baptism. No, he was baptized in order to enter into the temple. Interesting, huh? Next we have a messenger god giving a scroll to Pharaoh. And here are just some other hieroglyphics at the Edfu temple. These are all going horizontally. Here's another picture. Oh, this is part of the baptism picture, a little further out, with hieroglyphics around it. And I owe a lot of what I learned about Egypt to our guide, whose name was Midu. And he was a great guide in Egypt. We went there through an organization called Pilgrim Tours. And he was a Christian man, also had his master's degree in ancient Egyptology, which meant he could read the hieroglyphics. How fortunate we were to have him. And not only in addition to that, he was also, being a Christian, interested in connecting Bible times with Egyptian times. And so I was able to commensurate with him on some of the ideas that I had come to in studying ancient Egypt and studying the Bible, and he was able to verify a lot of the things that I had studied, and I learned a lot more things from him. But there he is explaining some of the hieroglyphics that we have at that temple. And here's some more hieroglyphics being interpreted by Midu. This one, can you tell what that animal is on the table? Probably, you might think of a porpoise or something. That's actually a crocodile. That's a crocodile. They revered crocodiles and even mummified them. And this temple was dedicated to the crocodile. Here's a picture of Sabek, the crocodile god, at the Kamambo temple. And here's a repository for mummified crocodiles. Did you ever think you'd see such a thing? Now here are some hieroglyphics that form a calendar. Did you ever look at something and think, I don't have to write that down, I'll remember it? That's what I thought about this calendar. I'll remember what the months are and the days and so on, and now I forget. Sorry about that. But this was an evolved calendar. Certain sides of this are the days, a certain side are the months, and something in the middle. Sorry, I can't explain it any better than that. Here's on a wall a hieroglyphic or a picture of a birthing stool. They encourage their women to give birth on a stool, not laying in a hospital bed. And that ugly-looking fellow in the middle there, it looks kind of like a, I don't know, what's he look like? Some kind of an imp. He is the god of birth and of a lot of other things. That's the god Bes. Now, one of the other things that Egypt is known for is their process of irrigation. So hieroglyphics, wonderful, interesting stuff, but irrigation was necessary for their survival. Not only did the Nile flood, but they also had to find ways for them to get the Nile River water up into their fields when it wasn't flooding. And so they developed this item called a shadoof, and it's a tool for irrigation. You can see in the picture that the bucket goes down into a shaft into the water of the Nile, and then is brought up by weights and swung over then to where it needed to be, the water to be put. Whoops. I thought I had a moving picture of that, but apparently that's not working. So irrigation, very important to them, and they developed that very good system. Another thing that they had to come up with was something on which to write their hieroglyphics besides walls. So they came up with using papyrus, a plant that grows along the Nile, to make paper. And of course they had men called scribes that would do the writing for them on this paper. Now I'm going to show you some pictures of the making of papyrus, and I'm going to try to make them kind of fast because I didn't have a video option on my camera. And you'll see this young lady making papyrus out of making paper out of a stalk of papyrus. Okay, here we go. Here's the beginning of it. She's holding up the papyrus. And there she's holding it again. She's cutting it into strips, putting the strips down, tearing it apart, laying it down, squeezing out the water, laying them crossways like we used to do in school. Did you ever do that when you're in elementary school? Lay pieces of paper crosswise and then put them together, and then using that item to our right, that press, she squeezes out the water, and you'd be amazed it turns into paper. Pretty neat, huh? There are some beautiful works of art on papyrus in that shop. That was one of my favorites right there. It shows the Pharaoh and a number of servants, just wonderful pictures. All right, so that is the beginning of Egypt. That is looking at the United Kingdom that was brought about by Menes, renamed himself Narmer. We looked at the beginning of the use of hieroglyphics, the development of paper, and irrigation from the Nile. Now we're going to begin looking at how the rest of the history of Egypt is divided. And we're just going to do an introduction here of those different kingdoms. First of all, the first era from 2700 to 2200 BC is called the Old Kingdom. Very imaginative, right? Then there is the first intermediate kingdom. Following that is the Middle Kingdom. Now let me go back and explain intermediate. The Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom periods are periods of time in which there is a pharaoh ruling over all of Egypt. There are dynasties. It's being passed on from one family to another. But sometimes those kingdoms fall apart for one reason or another. And so during that time period, when there is no centralized government, when there may even be civil war between parts of Egypt, when there may be an invader come into Egypt, those are called intermediate periods. And so the Old Kingdom is the first period we'll look at, from 2700 to 2200. Then we're going to briefly look at the first intermediate period, 2160 to 2010. And then we'll go on to the Middle Kingdom period, 2106 to 1786. And guess what happens after that? On second intermediate period. And then, see, we've had Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. What's next? New Kingdom. Yeah. And we're going to see throughout these kingdom periods some very interesting facts about Egypt. Some myths maybe will be busted of things you've heard. But we're also going to see how God was working through his people coming to Egypt and how God worked in Egypt through his people. It'll be very interesting. Come next time to Discovering His History. And if you missed any episodes, make sure you go to the website, scroll down to Discovering His Story, and you can look at previous episodes. You can also get an outline so that you can follow along with what we're doing as we progress through ancient times.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.